So I guess I'm making a sort of a general update on my view of the models and the theory and stuff like that. And that reminds me, there's some other small ancillary notes that I want to add onto the current sort of things that I've just been talking about in other recordings about borderline histrionic, my description of histrionic, and uh, sorry, I really think about that as I'm saying that, and covert narcissism and all those sorts of issues. I'm moving on from that. So just looking at the state of my theory, which is not the description of those conditions and personality disorders, um, but the core of metagram and metatype, and I want to make continue more theoretical speculation, and then I also want to ground that theoretical speculation within the general context of where I'm sitting in my models, which is problematic because I am not closer to integrating those models. And it might be the fact that they are each in a kind of unique permutation, and there's such, and in some sense, I mean, because they do fit into one another, you can make correlations, but the correlations, or perhaps not all of them have been discovered, but they're such perhaps sophisticated correlations that they are different dimensions. They're just looking at a different side of the elephant, as it were. And so it's good that I've come up with these different models, but in some sense, they don't very simply lock into each other like puzzle pieces. And so you can sort of say, oh yeah, that's in some sense it's a different dimensional cross cut or cross section of the elephant, and those outlines just look so different that you can't, how do these shapes fit with one another, because it's a different angle of cross section, and you would just, you would be forgiven thinking that these outlines are just completely alien to one another, that there's nothing correlated, um, because the cross sections just have such different um, geometry and surface area, and in some sense they're all compound variables, compounded and filtrated of each other, that there's no clear connection, there's no clear thread between the two, other than that they all precipitate and permeate from the same sort of general body or field, which is somewhat unsatisfactory in terms of being able to use it to self corroborate and self anyway. But I mean, it does all hinge on the, let's say, the philosophical machine of the 17 model. Everything comes from the 17 model, and in some sense, there is a particular magic that needs to be extracted from understanding how the 12 model is extracted from the 17 model, and then understand also the emotional tones and how they work within the 12 model, because there's some working between the 24 emotional tones and the 17 model. There is some cross pollination there, which I haven't been able to reverse engineer, but I used to know actually what that cross pollination was, and I still haven't rediscovered it. And then essentially the emergence of my model of the four sides of the mind, how to situate it with any of these things. I mean, it correlates directly with the 17 model, but it also, the form of it, or the initiation of that perspective, or the root of that four sides of the mind model, is something about the ontology of the false ego complex itself, um, not the pre-ontology of even, but in terms of how the inner child is constructed, because the inner child is, I believe, the primordial unit of the false ego complex. And although it can, if you want to sort of have the false ego complex, if you want to look at it, you should include the superego, um, even though because it's part of the system, as it were. But the sort of the thing that the snowflake is ensconced, or the thing that initiates the crystalline structure, the center of the snowflake or whatever, is at least some unit in the inner child. Now that's what I want to theoretically, speculatively go into. And I understand that there is a lot of clerical work that I should be trying to do to decode exactly what that cross-pollination magic is, because that might offer important clues to all these things. But in some sense, I'm continuing to theoretically speculate, half on the premise that these different models are commensurate, but they're not um, obviously consistent uh, uh, with each other, that they're consistent within a broader framework which I haven't fully narrated. But in some sense, if it's going to be a narrative anyway, then it's not, because they're like elephant cross sections. They just don't look like that they fit together. Then it doesn't exactly matter. That will be filled in at some point. That will be perhaps discovered and filled in at some point. But there's no structural benefit to harness from it. Although I've already conceded that there is a structural benefit that needs to be extracted from the 20 between the 24 emotional tones and the 17 model and the 12 model. There is a very important structure there that needs to be fully laid out. But anyway, moving on from that. Okay, so I think, and now this might be something, what I'm about to speak about now will be relevant to the four sides of the mind model. It will be relevant to metatype, and in some sense, whenever I mention metatype, it's sort of, the secret about metatype is that it's really up in the air, because it metatype is only grounded by metagram, and without a clear definitive correlation between metatype and metagram. In some sense, I know that there's 17 metatypes, and I know which metagram types belong to those 17 metatypes. So I know that. But I don't know exactly the internal circuitry of metagram. I don't know exactly what the overlay between that and the 17 model is, but I know that it'll be a consistent pattern that metatype is locking within itself. But that pattern itself might also be not a simple pattern. It might be slightly complicated, because there might be problems when you are dealing with dimensions that relate to that one of the special 5 dimensions. The final 5 dimensions out of the 17 are not final in their order, but final in their final in terms of that they're left over from the 12 model extraction. That maybe when metatype and metagram are overlaying themselves, that element sort of throws things off to some degree, or something like that. And the overlay of metatype and metagram might have to take those final 5 into account in a sort of in a special way, or in some sense maybe it won't take it into account in a special way, but it'll actually reduce the efficacy of it'll be something about metagram that has to be understood more clearly. That essentially, when you've got, because metagram is the description of emotional tone circuitry. So essentially, because that emotional tone circuitry corresponds, according to metatype, to a certain dimension on the 17 model, and one of those dimensions is one of the final 5, that in some sense it completely changes the character of that circuit, of that part of the circuit, of that emotional tone. Suddenly isn't just like an average emotional tone in the circuitry. It's sort of it's given us a weird kind of prominence. And it's those kinds of prominences which could lead to certain um, metatypes precipitating certain structural features like personality disorder themselves. That could be essentially what makes people prone to being a certain cluster, cluster A, cluster B, cluster C, personality disorders. So someone might have, because of the structure of metagram and metatype combined with the asymmetrical dispersion of these final five things, that those features combined might create these other overlays that would have to be but yeah, so that's a speculation anyway. So again, I'm just talking generally about structure, about these models and speculating about them. And the problem is that, I mean, the problem is that I'm lazy, I guess, to do all this clerical work. It's a lot of things to write everything out, and then to try to organize it, and then to try to sort of have it on the drawing board for long enough, and having it. I run out of space and things like that. But and it's not easy when when you are your own secretary, and as narcissistic as I am, perhaps it's not easy just to get down and do all the work. The boring clerical work of just making it look neat enough that it's easier to stare at and put all the pieces up so that I can maneuver them tangibly, to find the configuration that sees the pattern or whatever. But okay, so I've been putting that clerical work aside. But anyway, now I'm just going to focus on what I wanted to get to. So now what I wanted to talk about in terms of my theory is because one must also forgive me to some degree that the 17 model itself is very fucking complicated. It has it has, I mean, if you just see a model of it, you realize the level of sophistication that you're working with. There's so many angles that it's not it's not easy. And so there's a lot of chaos to try to sort of to find patterns in. I mean, the sophistication of the mechanics of the 17 model itself is just very problematic. Anyway, okay, moving on. So what I wanted to get to was, I had recently just been talking about philosophy. I made a YouTube video about commenting on what somebody else was talking about, and in that video, this was the one of me commenting on Daniel, who made some interesting points on the Stoa, and I was sort of somewhat criticizing and commenting and giving my own philosophy about it. And I think I've started to generate an idea, which actually originally this idea came to me from listening to a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard. And anyway, in this, it's a basic concept. The concept is, and I mean, it was also in the lecture, it was made as a very basic sort of thing, and it's a very useful technical sort of tool, but essentially sort of cutting through the metaphysics and simplifying it to some degree, and oversimplifying it to some degree, just to try to harness a basic principle. And then I'm going to get into how this works within my personality theory or whatever. Is that the basic unit in the universe is two, it's not one. You need to have two things. And when you try to have one thing instead of two things, and you try to orientate yourself towards one thing, the problem is that whatever makes that thing the type of thing that it is, it can't even be, its actual features, its actual characteristics are not relevant because there's only one of it. There has to be at least two of it for its actual features to become dynamically imposed on the area itself in some sense. I'm elaborating this. I'm illustrating it to some degree. So, in some sense, something that is just one thing, that is just what it is, and there's only one of it. In some sense, what it is becomes irrelevant because there's only one of them. But if there are two of them, then you can actually sort of actually and it's possible to be orientated towards two of these things. Then you can actually start to get a real sense of what is attracting you to it in the first place. You can actually a sense of and I guess within the metaphor of polarity, you can and well, what does it mean for something to be a unipolar thing? It's sort of well, without the concept of polarity, is there such a thing as is there a way to even know how attracted you are to something? Because the distance you are from something, there's no way to quantify that unless there's another of the same thing in which there are there are differences of the difference in dislocation, so that you can know that, okay, well, I'm actually closer to that than I am to that. It gives you a plane, a defined plane, as opposed to the unipolar thing, which has this problem of definition. And then essentially it can still exist, but what it is somewhat undefined. So it exists as something that is undefined. Okay, so the way to define it is that there must at least be two of them. Okay, so this is almost like esoteric metaphysics to some degree. But anyway, now this is true of the universe. It's not true of the mind. It's true of, in Scientology, it was called MEST, matter, energy, space, and time. It's not true of the actual thing that is the awareness of the awareness. And so the actual agent, the actual thing that inhabits the address of the conscious container, that it is its domain. It is its the furnishings belong to that process. To that sequential ontological fidelity that grounds its own character and beingness. So, I mean, there I just described beingness as the havingness of one's own container of consciousness. But anyway, so that doesn't need two. It doesn't need two inside of itself to operate. But anyway, and in some sense, that is what has made it crazy. Is that it has made a twin, and which is the self-image in some sense, which it has become an idolatry. And but anyway, I've given esoteric renditions of that kind of creation of the false ego. But moving on. What else? Okay, so what does the two? Okay, so anyway, this two thing. It got me thinking because in that philosophy example, I actually created in that recording that I made in response to what I heard on the Stoa, I created, I think, a very useful device, which is the understanding that grievances themselves, complaints, accusations, or whatever, or and I just made this as a sort of as a by definition, are not true. They're not real. The only thing that can actually ground the reality of a grievance is that it has a redress, it has a solution, that there is no This is actually the same concept as in Roman law, that there is no right. You don't have a right if there isn't a remedy. If there isn't a remedy in law, then there's no such thing as having a right in law. That the right implies that there is a remedy available to the right holder, essentially. There are no rights without a remedy. Um, the right implies a remedy. Uh, so it's the same basic concept, that there is no grievance without a solution. Um, there is no grievance without an actual redress, a possible redress, essentially, a possible redress to that grievance. So the problem is that when you have a grievance, it's hypothetical, perhaps, if you don't have, if you haven't reasoned clearly, maybe it's not even, in some sense I'm saying that, like, you haven't said anything, um, or it's an illogical grievance, or it's an impossible grievance, or something like that. It's got an error in conception hidden in it. And essentially the only way to know that it wasn't is that there actually is a real redress for it, and it is kind of coherent and reasonable in a general sort of framework. And I think that the problem of a kind of getting into, or the whole lecture was about game A and stuff like that, but that terminology aside, if you have two grievances that corroborate each other, then in some sense you can just be completely screwed, because your two grievances are just um, your two grievances that perhaps each of them don't even have a redress possible. They're like, the redress that they would need is just an unbounded restriction. It's like it's demanding a kind of absurd, infinite regress of limitation to preserve uh, uh, the fidelity of the grievance. So the grievance is actually very badly formulated. It's untethered. It's very vague. It's nebulous. There's a wonderful other Roman principle in law that is void for vagueness. That something carries no weight because it's in fact it's void. It should be considered invalid. It has no effect. It is as if it said nothing. It's void because it was vague. And so you can have two vague grievances that effectively, because they corroborate each other, create this kind of stability between them. And then between those two premises, they concoct or contrive a reality tunnel in which you've kind of got a stabilized reality matrix, and everything is plotted according to that kind of engine of reality, or that kind of that holographic kernel in some sense. And anyway, I'm not going to labor this too much, but that's, if you want to go listen to that, then you can go listen to that. But anyway, I think that the same thing applies in the false ego complex. I think that in the inner child, which I've always described as two emotional tones. In the four sides of the mind, it's four dimensions, but those dimensions are shared by other sides of the mind as well. So there's, like, some dimensions have feet in both sides of the mind, and are duplicated in different roles, because the four sides of the mind model is like an archetypal model, and it shows kind of functional. It sort of is there just to show the factional reach that each side of the mind has, and it's just a way of describing. In some sense, my four sides of the mind model is a. Actually, I don't want to. It's not easy to describe it. I was going to, because I like to try to use the analogy that socionics is a model of motivational digestion, and MBTI is a model of information cognitive digestion. Um, but anyway, and it's very hard for me to even use information or motivation, because the dimensions themselves are so robust are so complicated themselves, and some of these models might even need to be refined by attaching which circuit they actually correspond to. That it's not just because I've just, for example, in the 16 model, I've just got things described as that dimension, whereas there are two circuits in that dimension, and is it both circuits? I haven't actually even looked at that question. So there might be a refined four sides of the mind model that I need to issue, but I think even the approximate one that I've depicted is probably a much more accurate description of type than what the MBTI community is aware of at the moment. Anyway, um, okay. So basically, at least in the metagram model, and let's say my very up in the air overlay of metatype on top of that, which I should perhaps start to do. I should start to integrate those two things. I should actually get a definitive picture of what metatype means more so. Um, the problem is that that is also very complicated because, in some sense, whenever I've talked about metatype, I've actually always broken the metagram model because I've always wanted metatype to expand over many more dimensions, 10 dimensions at least. And that model has always seemed to work. That metatype model has always seemed to work. But then to overlay that on metatype, on metagram, maybe it doesn't have an overlay even. Maybe I should actually just start to describe them independently. But ironically, the four sides of the mind model is a different model to my metatype model. So actually, maybe I need to actually I need to have a look at my metatype model. And now that I've got all these other things to look at, so actually maybe that's actually the next step in the chain, is to actually make a metatype model which looks like it's really duplicating features in reality nicely, and then integrate that with metagram, if and or see how it plugs in, or see if there's a consistent correspondence between those two models, because and that might shed more light onto the four sides of the mind model as well. And I have to go in that sort of order. But anyway, okay. So in the metagram model, I know which circuit, which part of the circuit corresponds with the roughly the inner child. Actually, that does also, because in some sense, then I should actually I could have overlaid that already. In fact, then I could have taken, because in the metagram circuit, each side of the mind is represented by two emotional circuits, or sometimes it's not two. Sometimes the circuitry has more branches than that, um, if it's a complicated circuit. And in some sense, then I could already associate those pools of emotional circuits to the four sides of the mind model, and then I would have a much more accurate four sides of the mind model that would be tailored towards metagram and not just metatype. Because right now my four sides of the mind model is just a model of metatype. It's not a model of metagram. And combining those two, if I could actually find unique places to express that emotional tone, would give a certain sense of accuracy that would be sublime. It would be sublime. It would completely knock everything else so far out of the water, so far out of the running. It would give specificity. It would be very easy to type then. I must remember that. That will make it a lot easier to ascertain someone's type, and then that would make the whole job of psychometry much easier, also as a precursor to creating better psychological manuals, perhaps for facilitating people's self-actualization that is tailored towards their particular personality style. Um, yeah, so very exciting field that I have created, which basically no one else really knows about. Okay. Anyway, so the metagram elements. Uh, so roughly, there will at least be two emotional circuits um, that will correspond to the inner child, and and I've always called this within metagram. I've called this the lust and the death, and now I want to talk about the two grievances. So I think that the lust and the death might, now this might be completely wrong. This philosophical overlay might be completely off. But I'm going to guess that maybe the death and the lust are two grievances which combine in a kind of dipole, which stabilize the whole false ego complex. It is the seed of the whole false ego complex, and in some sense, the death acts almost like the magnetic fluid, and the lust acts like the electric fluid. Because, oh, I mean, this pattern, I have always observed this pattern within the false ego complex, that essentially the death and the lust is essentially on a on a very deep thematic level recapitulated by the next side of the mind, by the subconscious, by the subconscious's. I'm just trying to think what to call it, because I've gone through so many generations of labeling them differently. But vanity and enticed lust, and then is another, which then is another recapitulation in terms of what I used to call the superego. Or now I've changed my terminology to be more up to date with what other people were using. So I mean, um, so I'll call it the ego. But in my notes, anyway, if anything happens to me and my notes become the only repository, I feel like I need to sort of point these things out. But essentially, I used to call the ego the superego in my notes. But anyway, which I guess is very confusing, because I mean, I guess, I have been a what's the word? I have been a culprit of using terminology that I didn't know and sort of adopting it and weaving it into my own tapestry, and then I realized that I've perhaps been using it badly, because I don't read the orthodoxy. I don't read the traditional text, because sadly they are so far inferior to my work. They are nowhere close, and in fact, a lot of all the interesting things that they have are precipitates of my work. Although that'll make me sound like a conspiracy theorist. But anyway, um, so let me just say that okay, so that the trial and the sin are again a recapitulation of the vanity and the enticed lust, which is a recapitulation of the death and the lust. And okay, and that is also, anyway, within my Star of David diagrams, of the three different gunas, that's you can see that the two triangles have that same pattern. That the So I guess you could call, like, the one triangle the magnetic fluid, and the other triangle the electric fluid, in some alchemical analogy. But and I mean, I depicted this using the Star of David, and I even called each triangle their own name. So I called the one the theme, and the other one the presentment. Obviously, the presentment being the electric fluid, and the theme being the magnetic fluid. But anyway, that's irrelevant. Okay, just basically saying that these two grievances, in some sense, are spelled out at different levels of the false ego complex, and in some sense, their fundamental corroboration is vested in the inner child. So the key really is in the inner child, I think, um, in order to sort of unlock the to see past the inner child and to unlock the perspective of the superego, which has been supplanted by this weed of the false ego complex, which, as I've said before, is a corroboration of these two grievances. What else? What else? Okay, anyway, so yeah, I had more to say just than using analogies of interesting things. Okay, now this is important, because essentially this is important for therapy, because then I know the emotional tone signatures of the two grievances, and I know that they must each be, if I'm right about these two grievances, that they must each be uncovered separately in terms of their separate contents, because essentially it's been their collaboration and also their abrasion of each other that what effectively sort of is the resonant drama, is the resonance that is the tune of the and the melody of the drama in all the other structures, in some sense, are traced back to that fundamental scenario. So what to say now? Okay, so anyway, so I mean, I guess I don't really have that much more insightful things to say, but I just thought that I would point that out. And in some sense, then those two emotional tones might be the kind of the archetypal the grappling of the intertwining of those two emotional tones could be the basic semantic signature of the basic engram as well. So there might be things that can be taken from Scientology, from their therapy and or from their auditing, and from their vast experience in dealing with engrams, that there might be a codex that can be derived from correlating or corroborating these pairs of emotional tone with certain engramic structures. So there is that. Which would perhaps make targeting reactive minds much easier in terms of what's the word? In terms of facilitating a gradient of unwinding that particular drama, or unwinding that particular primordial, or leveraging that particular primordial conflagration into something that is dissipating its self. But I guess it is interesting to note that the emotional tones on the other sides of the mind are different. So the emotional tone circuitry is more complicated in the other sides of the mind. But dealing on those primordial issues in some sense, I mean, I guess it's not going to be a panacea, perhaps, because maybe it is. Maybe that is the way to go. Maybe that is the foolproof sort of way to sort of induct someone into self-actualization. Or it could be that there are mechanisms in the other sides of the mind which are so toxic and that are so overriding that the inner child is just inaccessible in some sense, or sort of insulated and encapsulated by that other overarching structure which has taken over the seat of consciousness in some sense. So maybe what I'm saying is only relevant for someone who is, let's say, on that level of spiritual need, that is aware of their own spiritual need, who has their seat of consciousness relatively closely located to their inner child, and they're not entracted into certain diversionary obsessions with the other sides of the mind. Because I guess perhaps having a seat of consciousness, perhaps some people don't even have a seat of consciousness because uh, uh, in some sense they might be operating out of one of the sides of the mind predominantly, but it is so entracted into a kind of internal feedback with the other sides of the mind that it's fundamentally dispersed, so that essentially there is no coherent thing that can actually even receive messages in some sense. It's just a kind of reactive automaton uh, to such a large extent. I think in some sense, I think the inner child needs to be catered to. I think in some sense, it is the overriding powerhouse in the false ego complex. In some sense, it's the revenge of unconsciousness, usually, if it is not being catered to um, overtly. Uh, so it is the resident master. And so perhaps it would be worthy to treat it as such, because that would in some sense also, a culture that did so in general would be a saner culture, would be a more grounded culture, would be a less prone to hysteria and such, and collective forms of spiraling and entrenched sort of dispersal of a seat of consciousness, which is probably what we're experiencing at the moment in the zeitgeist with this fascistic identity politics and stuff like that. Okay, so I've said my piece, I guess. That's all I wanted to talk about. Okay, and then I guess the deeper thing should be said is that also then those two issues, those two grievances, which lock you into the false ego complex, in some sense, they're like the obligation that keeps you in. So the false prophet in the superego might have the contract that creates the false ego complex, but the obligation of the contract is what binds you to it. And the obligation, I believe, is perhaps these two grievances, the death and the lust. And in some sense, then I can get a better picture of it, perhaps, if I can ground the death and the lust first to the 17 model to work out which dimensions they relate to. And in fact, now I'm having my reverse engineering spidey sense is tingling now. I feel that it's actually, the dipole is made up of one dimension that has the green circuit from one dimension and the red circuit from another dimension. Because each, on the 17 model, there are two threads going through each dimension. Um, so I feel like maybe it's a collaboration of one from the one and another from the other. That might not be true. There might be something completely, maybe even this whole model is this whole suggestion is completely off. But I know that within the 17 model and understanding personality types, or understanding the emotional tones, that there is something to do with one circuit from one dimension and another circuit from another dimension. But anyway, I don't even want to think about that level of complexity right now. Anyway, I'm trying to work out what the pattern is there. But perhaps I also need to find that book that I used when I was like 5 years old. The book on grammar theory, on verb valency, which was like, I think it was from the 1950s or 1960s. No, I think it was from the 1950s. Anyway, maybe it was even from the 1970s, but I think it was from the 1950s or 60s. Where all good academia last appeared in the literature before everything went to shit. Okay, anyway, so what else? Okay, well, yeah, so, but that's more information. So essentially, if I know the dimensions, even if I don't know which circuit of the dimensions, but if I can pinpoint it towards the circuit in the dimensions and the emotional tones, all of that information is very, very specific. And in some sense, the dimension will obviously be the ground that the emotional tone was planted in. And just metaphorically visualizing that, this is the type of ground, this is what the ground looks like. It looks like this dimension, and this is the tone that's being planted in it. And then you know that the ground on the next dimension has this other tone planted in that. That gives you a very good abstract picture, a very good rendition, a very high resolution abstract rendering of what's going on. And then perhaps I need a better metaphor of understanding, well, if these two things are both planted and then they grow into the same tree, they combine, how do they combine? How do they make peace with one another? They have to see themselves as a false dichotomy, as essentially as a false binary. They produce a binary, and that false binary is essentially the seed of the false ego complex. And so to understand then that you are going to associate that one composite with everything that is good, and with the knowledge of good, and the other composite with the knowledge of evil, then it's going to be very clear the kind of, it might be easier even to philosophically disentangle the structures of the false ego complex, because on a conceptual level you might be able to subtract exactly the overshooting. You can actually demarcate the flaws of the inner child, and therefore gain access back to the superego. And in that wise, in that frame of mind, one can perhaps demolish the contract which foists the seat of consciousness from the superego into. So essentially, you can facilitate a return back to the superego by being able to essentially renunciate the false ego by just pervading it, by understanding it in its totality in some sense. So that would be a kind of model for therapy, a kind of particularized renunciation in a conceptual cleanup level. Okay, moving forward, there was another point that I was thinking about as I was saying that. Or was it another theory about therapy? It was to describe a characteristic. I think I wanted to describe a characteristic about what life would be like from the perspective of the superego, Damn, I had a memory about something. I wanted to add a point, an important point. Was something about the experience of the superego. In some sense, I think it's always possible to return to the superego, but it's so uncomfortable to inhabit because of the presence of the inner child. Essentially, the kind of the resonant frequencies that the inner child is projecting, that coalesces the false ego complex itself, that that occupies that space, essentially, that it's too much for the superego to be channeled by the mind or by the intellect. The intellect can't essentially attune itself to the superego perspective because it's just made so it's eviscerated by the 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 displacement caused of what has been stolen into the false ego complex, essentially. So it's like having a weight in your mind, and so it's just easier to sort of to take it from the weight's perspective, to take it from the weight's point of view, um, than to have to burden the weight from outside of it. But it is possible to do that as well. It is possible to take that kind of excruciating look beyond that sort of that pierces itself. I guess you could call this a form of crucifixion in some sense, and that might also be sort of an inexorable part of the process as well. But this is not. I can't remember the point that I wanted to raise now. Um, that the superego is damn, there was an important point that I wanted to raise. Damn, it's completely slipped my mind. Um, maybe I should just try to talk it out and see if I can find it again. So, two two grievances. There's a false dichotomy, and the one implies the other. You know, like yin and yang as well. And it's how did they become one thing? Essentially, the absence of the one defines the other one. Um, Essentially, that makes the world computable. That grounds reality within the matrix of the false ego perspective. Essentially, because you've got this preordained assertion which you are relying on, that if not, then the other one. Um, There was a point that I was going to make about what something about the superego, something about how it would function or how it would. Oh, yes. Now I've got it. Okay, so I mean, I've made this point half before, but I didn't properly articulate it, and I probably won't properly articulate it now. But when I talk about my own false ego complex, that it's perhaps useful to have had a false ego because in some sense it needs to be understood. Its mechanics needs to be understood and properly triumphed over and transcended, because otherwise you're not capable of enduring the world. You're not capable of actually of being able to suspend. I don't know how to say this. Suspend not the operation of your superego and your integrated 17 model, but to be able to burden that it appears that it has been suspended externally, sort of to the idea that the interior must be distinct and separate from the exterior temporal. Well, I guess it's not even exterior if you just call it temporal. But yeah, the temporal thinking, the mental karma of temporal thinking needs to be grappled with. Even it needs to be withstood. It needs to be able um, to be coped with. Essentially, it needs to be able to be absorbed. Even it needs to be able to be handled. And in some sense, that means that you have to be okay with appearing to deploy a false ego complex. You have to be able to resolve the problem of appearing to utilize a false ego complex. That is like an existential problem, that it's like a perennial existential problem that needs to be resolved. It needs to be reconciled with. And the reconciliation of that means that you have to conquer it in at least one concrete space at one time, which means you actually have to perhaps, well, maybe there are other ways. There might be other ways to actually simulate the same efficacy, maybe not. But in some sense, we do need to know how to conquer the appearance of the false ego. Or we need to be able to handle appearances. To not lose the integrated 17 functioning. By the mere appearances of the false ego. And so one must be able to cloak oneself in an appearance, without losing one's sanity in some sense. Okay, no. It's mainly okay. I'm thinking about this more as being a recipient. That if you have an integrated 17 dimensions of psychological reality and you're fine, but you are in a world that forces you to put on labels, to forces you to endure epistemic injustice, whatever it may be, that you can actually not have your interior organization of psyche be imprinted by that, but still be able to play the part. And in some sense, this is exactly what Jesus was doing when he gave his accusers what they wanted. He even agreed with his accusers. He even said in front of them to God, "Why have you forsaken me?" he joined his accusers. He made it an open question so that they would have to inherit his question and be cursed with the Holy Ghost to find the answer to the question. By joining his accusers and merging with them in spirit, he dissipated his pure identity by relegating his honor. He did not answer their accusations. He put himself in dishonor by not answering them. He did not speak up for himself, and then he asked an open question, not disagreeing with them. In some sense, the question that he asked was on their behalf. And in some sense, it proceeded from their premise that he had been forsaken. And so by merging with the appearance of the false ego in a mob form, he led captivity captive as well, but in some sense he grappled with them. He didn't give them the cold shoulder. He participated with them on their level. And there are more subtle forms of this, of doing this in the world. Which take the form of tolerance. And in some sense, the fruit of tolerance is not a material, worldly consequence that resolves the thing that you're tolerating. It's the higher synthesis. It's the higher spiritual synthesis that actually engineers perhaps even a greater spiritual reconciliation. And a higher level of functioning, or is possible because of that as well. But it's not that promise of that utopian ideal. If essentially without the propensity to sacrifice, without the propensity to endure. Okay, I've gotten way too lofty in this, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that you must be able to follow the rules. You must be able to render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And the only way to do that, in some sense, is to be able to conduct oneself and comport oneself with the appearances of the false ego, because the world is strewn with the appearance of false ego, even if it doesn't have false egos. That's the face that you confront. That's what you meet when you go to the store. That's the nature of any system. I mean, in some sense, it's a level of interpretation, but in some sense, it's that interpretive data which the world is fundamentally comprised of, and the world um, will not how to say this. That basic feature of how we experience the world won't ever change, but the vision about it and the acuity that that vision facilitates that will allow for higher levels of functioning will perhaps change things, but those things that are changed will only be seen with the spiritual eyes. It's not a question of things being different. It's a question of people seeing differently. Um, the basic uh, operations of the world will still be the same. Um, anyway, yeah. So I mean, to put a small, I could have done, I could have said it a lot short, in much more briefly if I had just, if I was okay to say it bluntly and slightly incorrectly and certainly inaccurately, that we must know how to handle the currency of the world without being polluted by it. Um, because the currency of the world will never be expunged in some sense. Um, and that mint will always be there. Um, it's hard to make a convincing argument around this without sounding like you've got your spirituality wrong, because I mean there is an asymmetry which essentially which the false ego thinking is very perniciously fixated on, which is the idea that it can offer a semblance of security, that if you can just solve the problems that it construes and contrives, that then the problems are solved. And the kind of thing that I just outlined says something like, you know, there's no final there's no final form where things will be perfect. But I believe, well, that is what the scriptures also, I think, corroborate uh, with um, with my understanding, that it is a quickening spirit. Uh, it's not a perfect spirit; it's a quickening spirit. The spirit of truth is the quickening spirit. That's a infinitive verb. Um, anyway, so I mean, there's that to sort of, which is why I guess a lot of my things a lot of what I just said sounds probably a bit loose and vague. But anyway, let me stop this diatribe now. It's long enough, but yeah, I think this has been an important recording for at least navigating some of my position. I must actually write out a list of things to work on integrating with my models, and then when those models are, because there are some refinements that I need to make, that I know that it's capturing something that is absolutely there to be measured, and then essentially, if I can just get enough psychometric sort of data collected, then then the models should be operational enough that even if I don't win the philosophical arguments, if I make a typology, I could I could essentially use that to disseminate all of this stuff anyway. Because it would be a more successful typology than the other ones, although it would be very, very intricate, which is not always the best thing. I mean, having 48 unique types is a bit unwieldy, but anyway.